Howdy, howdy, Bernie.
Howdy there. So this is an audio, correct?
Yeah, you don't have to have your Skype camera on. It may actually be better to turn it off to
Okay.
eliminate interference. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, having visuals is nice and all, but so many people have told me I have a great radio voice. It makes me sick. So I decide, all right, in that case, I'll just make everybody happy by making an audio-only show to keep the integrity of the voice. So that's my excuse for making my radio show audio-only. But hey, I think it's valid. So, oh, you're just putting a paper over the camera because you can't turn it off?
I can turn off. I just don't know how to do
Oh,
it.
okay. Whatever. Well, you can leave it on. It's all right. You just can't see me. But anyhow, um, I'm glad you contacted me to come on my show. I'm always open to people contacting me to come on my show, although I will say at least one occasion, I'm not going to name any names, some guy came on my show, but then shortly before the show, I heard from someone, hey, what are you letting this guy on your show for? He's just going to come on your show to do a sales pitch. There's nothing spiritual about him. He's just trying to sell his work. And I did
Sure.
a little research that day, and I find out that that was true, so I canceled the show and didn't explain to the guy why. But I have no doubt this is going to be completely different with you. I've looked it over some of the things that you sent me and all, and you seem very legit in regards to your cave art research. Now, to start off the show, I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself, what you've experienced in life that causes you to do the things you do. Is cave art the only thing you do? I mean, I'm willing to go a full 2 hours here, but if cave art is the only subject we can talk about, we may not need a full 2 hours. But if there's more things besides cave art that you can research, then by all means, this is your opportunity to talk about that. So introduce yourself, what you've experienced in life. Please be a nice primary source for the listeners. You got the floor.
Hi, this is Bernie Taylor, author of Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. Thank you for inviting me to the show. It's a pleasure. I've listened to a few of your programs, and there's some synergy with some of your speakers from the past, especially Jonathan Young, who spoke about the hero's journey. Um, my book, Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, started about 15 years ago with a different book, Biological Time. And Biological Time looked at the timing of plants and animals. How does a salmon know when to spawn? How do the geese know to migrate? And so on. And I studied the question from endocrinology, from wildlife behavior, predator-prey relationships, all these sorts of things. And then I asked the question, well, someone must have known this before. And that led me to hunter-gatherer calendars. And lo and behold, hunter-gatherer calendars, as well as the ancients, had told of when they're going to catch salmon, when they're going to catch harvest eggs and for the geese and so on. They need to know this because in their time, they didn't have Costco's and Fred Meyer's and all these sort of niceties that we do. That if they arrived at the river when the salmon wasn't there, there was no food because they were leaving some other food supply behind, whether it be berries or deer, elk, or whatever it might be. So the question became, who knew this? And of course, it was the hunter-gatherers. But hunter-gatherers go back in time much further than that. Hunter-gatherers go back into the Paleolithic. So we have our first record of the hunter-gatherers going back about 40,000 years ago in the caves in Spain, as well as Indonesia. And I asked the question, well, if the hunter-gatherer knowledge was among the people, Native Americans, United States, and so on, could it be in those places as well? And primarily looked at the cave of Lascaux, which has some very clear images of seasonality. There's a large megalosaurus, which is something like a red deer, and he's blowing steam, so it's in the morning. He also has a full rack, which typifies the fall. In the cave system, there's a bunch of a small herd of deer crossing a river, and they also have full racks. And so these are all times of the year which would indicate the fall. I asked the questions, and I came up with a numerology of how they could have used the cave art to tell time and to mark the seasons and so on. And it wasn't. It was published probably about 13, 14 years ago, and did a lot of papers and conferences and interviews and those sorts of things. But I realized it was kind of ahead of its time, that people were still catching up on the whole biological clock thing, especially related to timing in the real world versus the lab. So then I went, I put it on the shelf. I said, for 10 years, I'm going to leave this behind and let the world catch up. And during that time, they did. And many people wrote books about this sort of things, plant and animal timing, and it became more of a commonplace thing. And then I went back to it. I said, I'm going to look at this a little further, because I looked at some other images at Lascaux Cave, and I thought that I could go a little further into the concept of the animal timing in the caves. And I was looking, I need to go to older caves, because I believe that this went much back further in time. And at that point, the oldest cave was El Castillo. I was looking at an old panel called the Gallery of Discs. And on the Gallery of Discs, there's about 80 discs that stream across. It's 10 meters long. And no one had identified any animals on that panel. It's a huge panel. It's one of the largest panels in the Paleolithic record. And only we've identified these red discs, which are kind of an illusion. So I asked myself, well, there's got to be something more of this on this panel. And the most prolific animal in Paleolithic art is of horses. So I started looking for a horse. I didn't find a horse. I didn't find a horse until almost 2.5, 3 years later. But right away, I did find an elephant. Are you still there?
Yes, and I'm on mute, so nobody can hear me breathing in the background. So, yeah.
Okay. So I found an elephant. And, there were elephants in Europe at that time. They were a different kind of elephant than we find in Africa today. And the type of in Europe have now gone extinct. But we have bones from that time period. We can reconstruct what the elephants looked like. And they had a big humped head. The elephants that were in Europe, they were straight tusk elephants. And whereas the African elephant has more of a rounder, flatter head. And the woolly mammoth also has a humped head as well. So it wasn't a European elephant, and it wasn't a woolly mammoth. And so I reached deep into my background, and I contacted someone I'd met a long, long, long time ago. His name is George Schaller. And I met George when I was in my mid-20s, so we're talking more than 25 years ago. I met him in Beijing, China. I was living there at the time for 4 years in the business world. And George was traveling through, and I met him at a social out at the so-called Ming tombs, which are outside Beijing. And we met with a bunch of other people in this long line of lions, these huge marble lions that, we're talking 15, 20 feet tall. And that was suitable for George because George is one of the foremost wildlife biologists in the world with a specialty in lions. So George goes way back, and he was if you can think of anybody in wildlife behavior, George was the mentor, including Jane Goodall. So I contacted George out of the blue for him. He didn't remember me. Of course, I remembered him because he was on National Geographic magazine at the time, and he was wearing a Rolex. And he's not a Rolex person, but the Rolex was he was their cover guy to promote snow leopards. So I asked George, can you identify this elephant? And so for a few weeks we went back and forth, and we ultimately decided that we couldn't tell if it was an African elephant or European elephant because it was young. It was a young elephant, and maybe that the European elephants, the straight tusk elephants, might have had these roundish heads. But it clearly wasn't a woolly mammoth because we have remains of woolly mammoths that show this humped head. So George and I went back and forth, and we also during this process we started looking at finding other animals in the cave. And one of them is a Barbary macaque. And we know the Barbary macaque from a James Bond movie. I think it was The Living Daylights, where they're at Gibraltar. And another agent gets killed, and James Bond is chasing the perpetrator down the road in Gibraltar, a British colony. And the Barbary macaque keep jumping on the hood of the car and the windshield. And that's kind of the world's introduction to the Barbary macaque, or the Barbary ape. And the Barbary ape while it's in Gibraltar now, it's not indigenous to Gibraltar. It's believed that the British brought it over in the last few hundred years, and the DNA shows that it's not indigenous. The only place that the barber macaque is indigenous is in the Atlas Mountains of Western North Africa, so Morocco. And George, right away, he identified, I recognized it as some sort of primate. And George right away said, that's a barber macaque, because it's the only primate with a wide rump. And so George and I, at that point, he got real interested. And then there was another animal we found, which I showed him was a lion. And there was a lion and a lioness. And the question became whether it was an African lion or a European lion, because there were cave lions in Europe at the time. And the female was quite clear, but the male had apparently this large mane. And none of the other images of Paleolithic cave art have this European large mane lion, which is more typical of Africa. But again, we didn't know if there were any lions in the caves with large manes. But we did have this barber macaque. It was pretty clear. It has all the head and the arms, how it's folded, and all this sort of stuff. And online, I've posted a picture of on my webpage and on my Facebook and so on, this barber macaque next to our actual barber macaque, and its arms and legs are in the exact same positions. So the Paleolithic artists weren't just looking at it's an animal, but they were looking at the very detailed features taxonomically, which was quite fascinating for George. And so he starts getting more interested in this as well. And then as we go, we start digging up more animals in the cave. And one was important, the most important of all of them. And it is the giraffe. And I emailed George. I saw the giraffe, and I emailed George, and I said, I got a giraffe. And right away he responds back. And as I'm seeing his email coming back, I realized there's two giraffes. And the juveniles wrapped its neck around the adults. And again, it's something I've posted online and my Facebook and webpage and so on before Orion.com. Well, when we saw that giraffe, it became important because there were no giraffes in Europe during the time. I mean, millions of years ago there were, but not in the time of humans being in Europe or even Neanderthals being in Europe. So this person had been to Africa. So an artist in the northern part of Spain, near Cantabria, in Cantabria region near the city of Bilbao, had been to Africa. And it was the first time that someone actually chronicled an archaeological find between the two places. So George and I, we're pretty excited about this giraffe. And what's fascinating is that the giraffe, the juvenile, wraps its neck around the mother's, and the head sits just below hers. So it's a tender moment as well. The artist didn't just capture the taxonomic details of the animal, but the artist captured the emotions of the animals, how the animals felt in their perception, and of course this mother and young giraffe. And then there was another important image we found. It is a Iberian lynx and her young, and the Iberian lynx young pushes its head pushing against the ruff of the chin of the mother cat. And so the lynx baby's a kitten. And we say the mother is the lynx cat. And which also a tender moment between the two. And when I was going back and forth through emails to George, and I would ask him the questions, sort of biological things. Well, what do you think is going on here? What, timing of the year and so on. And we found that he gave me responses back. It's a tender moment between the lynx and her kitten. He had seen similar relations between lions in Africa and their cubs. And he said very similar types of things about all the animals. So when George, he wasn't telling me about, details about the animal itself, but he saw them as humanish or beings, not as wild animals. And that goes along with what Jane Goodall talks about, that she doesn't say wild animals, she says animal beings. And she says that if we're good to animal beings, it makes better people or beings like ourselves. So George and we went back and forth. We found these animals on both sides. And then I realized that the The African animals were on one end of the panel, and the European animals were on the other. So we have two different places. We have two different places on this panel. So we're talking about a journey, and that became important because at that point I realized this cave panel isn't about just the tender moments of the mother cat and her kitten, but it's also about a journey that someone took between the Iberian Peninsula, now Spain, and Western North Africa. And that led me to starting looking further at the characters. And they just weren't animal beings. They're also human beings. And human beings in different activities. There's one of a teacher, parent teacher talking to or sharing some information into the apprentice. You can see the ear of the one and the mouth of the other, and full features of these two. There's another man who is swimming, doing a freestyle crawl, and he's in the middle of the image. And then there's another man at the other end, which is apparently sort of climbing. So there's a journey where there's a story told in one place, a person who then swims across a water passage and then climbs at the end, which was important. In the middle of the image, too, we also found a dolphin, and it's a bottlenose dolphin. Taxonomically, it's pretty clear. And it's either a spinning bottlenose dolphin, or there's a bottlenose dolphin and the young, because it shows more than one fin. More fins than one would be appropriate for one dolphin. And the person who's swimming is just above the dolphin. So that geographically became the Strait of Gibraltar. In the historical record, there is no evidence that anybody has, in Paleolithic times, had swum across the Strait of Gibraltar. And the story is that in the archaeological and anthropological journals is that people traveled around the Mediterranean very slowly to get to Europe over thousands of years. But this doesn't jive with the actual images we can now see in the caves that people actually swam across, and the artists saw not just they saw the details of a giraffe, such that you couldn't see if someone told you a story about a giraffe, because you have the juvenile wrapped around the mother's neck, you have the horns of the mother giraffe, and the details of the elephants and other animals are quite extraordinary. And so we have, for the first time in history of mankind, we have these animals, people traveling across the Strait of Gibraltar. As I started looking at these, I also realized there was a pattern in these animals, and not just that there were two different places, but there was a pattern in mythology of these animals, patterns that we have common stories between North America and Europe and Eurasia and Africa. And one of them is called the cosmic hunt. And the cosmic hunt is either of the mother bear, Ursa Major, who climbs into the sky, or of Orion, the hunter, who climbs into the sky. And so we looked at, I looked into these myths further and found that the myths of peoples around the world are encapsulated in this cave, this panel, and some others. And that's ultimately what the book became about that journey of the story of the myths. And as I said a few months ago, you had Jonathan Young in the program. And Jonathan Young talked about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is primarily derived from the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. In the hero's journey, someone travels from one place to another, and on that journey, they experience magical beings. They're aided by a wizard or some sort of teacher, and they're given special amulets or swords or some sort of implements to help them on their way. And in that journey, they go to a place where they come to face themselves. And in Darth Vader in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars travels into the cave. And in the cave, he meets with Darth Vader. And as he fights with Darth Vader, he lobs off Vader's helmet, and in it he sees his own self. And of course, the story is Luke Skywalker is George Lucas, and the person of Darth Vader is just, we learn to be his father. If you haven't seen it, well, it's been out for a few years, so I'm not going to call it a spoiler. So in this story, the hero's journey, the hero he faces himself, and then he travels back to tell his story. What's fundamentally we have in this Paleolithic cave, we have an individual who travels from Spain, swims across the Strait of Gibraltar, and travels into North Africa, where he encounters animals. He goes to a place, and then he returns. And in that journey, he encounters a lot of animals, and he learns about them on the way. He learns about that the mother giraffe protects her young by the patterns on the spots, the molted patterns, and how the neck of the juvenile blends into his. He learns that the lion is at the top of the panel and the top of the food chain, and that the lioness licks him or feeds him or nuzzles him or something like that, which is one of the images that's portrayed. And there's many other animals that he meets on this journey, such as the dolphin and so on. And he learns about himself, and he learns about the natural world. And that becomes his journey. And in the book, which I'm not going to give you because it's the end, but he does go to a specific place on this journey. It's a place that we know in the mythology of the Greeks. And it's one of the last, it's in the labors of Hercules. And in this place, Hercules is challenged, and he comes to faces himself, and he goes back and so on. And so what comes out of these Paleolithic caves is that they're not just animals. They're not just stories that were lost, but they're still the myths that are still within us. Joseph Campbell, he believed, I think I heard with Jonathan Young, that that there was some common source in Siberia where the myths first came about among shamanic peoples. And Joseph Campbell had looked into the caves of Europe with a French anthropologist, Andre Leroy-Gourhan. And Leroy-Gourhan had seen patterns in the caves, that in one room chamber there'd be males, another be females, and at the deeper parts of the chamber you'd find more anthropomorphic figures, man, human combinations. And Joseph Campbell said, well, that must be, he hypothesized that it would be a ritual, because you have the same type of places in these caves, and so it's a repetitive type of situation. But he never made the connection to that the myths were actually in the caves, which is very important. Is this something that you've heard before? What's your sense so far?
Oh, I've heard a lot of things about cave art, but you're certainly including a lot of things that I haven't heard yet. So this is interesting to say the least, and I have no intention of interrupting you. I love it when I have a guest on who can just spell out lots of important information and me just sit back and listen. That's great, but a lot of people accuse me of filibustering my guests too much, so this is a good thing. So, anything else you want to offer before I start asking you questions? Because I got my notepad here and jotted a few things down as we went along.
Okay, sure. Actually, I'll go. There's one more thing I'll bring into it as part of the premise, is that the animals that we found in the cave, this gallery of discs in the El Castillo cave, they're also the same pattern as one sees them in the night sky. Okay, and so we found the man on one end. There's a man on one end in Spain. There's a man on the other end in Western North Africa, and there's a dolphin in between. And there's other animals there's a horse, there's an eagle. Well, if you start lining up a man, a horse, an eagle, and a marine animal, and then there's a seal, going down these lines, you have Hercules, you have Pegasus, Aegea, Pisces, and then Cetus, the sea monster. And what I believe happened is that the Greeks, Phoenicians, and the ancient Egyptians had been to these caves. And when they went to these caves, they recognized that there were patterns, and that they were patterns of possibly astronomy. And then they found those patterns. They looked into the night skies and saw those same patterns and created many of the constellations that we know today. So that those patterns of those constellations are stories, where one constellation leads to another on a journey. In the Paleolithic, for the Paleolithic artist, this hero that traveled from from Spain, northern Spain, to West North Africa, could have looked up to the night sky, and he could have, as he walked, or she walked, most likely he, because all the traveling characters are men. As they migrated across this region, they could have looked to the night sky and guided their way by these constellations. And this is not a new idea. This is perhaps a new idea for Paleolithic cave art, but it's not a new idea in archaeoastronomy. The Lakota Sioux traveled around the Black Hills in the same manner, and at the summer solstice they would end at Bear's Lodge, which we call Devil's Tower, which is quite fascinating. It's their cosmic mountain, where they ended their summertime or spring to summer pilgrimage and had a great ceremony, which was the Sundance. So this is not a new idea that people traveled with the stars and they traveled on a journey, and that they had a ceremony at the end. And my book also points to cosmic mountains as places that they traveled to. So there might be some deep story or myth that we carry on from traditions that go between the Native Americans back to West North Africa. And the story has to be at least 23,000 years ago. Native Americans came down 15 to 17,000 years ago. It's arguable one way or the other. But they came out of Beringia, which was what we now call the Bering Strait. And they were in Beringia until about 23,000 years ago. So the myths must be before 23,000 years ago. So I can throw that one in as there's a what happens below is also above, as you've probably heard from Hermetics who spoke on your program. You're on.
Yes, thank you. First of all, some of the things you pointed out, mentioned Orion. Why that constellation among all constellations? I mean, and if you found maybe anything in the cave art that talks about like prehistoric wars with Orion, because there's been legends of before Earth was around, there was wars with Lyra and Orion, and George Lucas, since you're a Star Wars fan, modeled many of the things we see in the Star Wars movies after the Orion Wars. It's been said by many in the spiritual and contactee community. But what is about that constellation?
Good question. That the title of my book is Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. And before Orion means before the Greeks. And why around the world people identify the stars or the figure of Orion with or without the so-called belt, the three belt stars. And the reason we do that is that we can see it as a man, or as a figure. We call it a man, but someone could call it, I've never heard of anybody calling it a woman, but it could be called a woman as well. But people around the world from prehistoric times so we can say people in Siberia and North America, as well as Africa, they identify the Orion as a human because it actually looks like a human. You can, any other star constellation in the night sky, maybe it looks like a dog, maybe it looks like a cat, maybe it's a horse or a cow. I'm not really sure. Ursa Major is sometimes a reindeer. Most often it's a bear, or it's a boar. But there's very few people cultures that don't identify Orion. And the reason why Orion has stayed with us throughout time is the stars are very far from Earth. And if you see, an airplane that's extremely far distance, it seems to travel very slow. It keeps its shape, whereas an airplane that just zooms over your head loses its shape very quickly. Well, Orion is so far in light years from us that over these tens of thousands of years, it's kept its shape, or its form. It's the identifiable form as a what we would consider human. I would guess that Orion, the constellation of Orion, was the first constellation that man identified in the sky. And next to that would be Sirius being the brightest star in the sky. But sometimes Sirius is found as a dog, and sometimes it's found as just a dog star, or a constellation is what's it called, the constellation of the dog, and sometimes Sirius is only a dog star. And that's another one that's found around the world as a dog. And so the companion of Orion, in its many names, of a hunter or a hero, has this companion dog. And the companion dog is also typically associated with the afterlife. And that's a commonality among hunter-gatherers and ancients throughout the world, which also draws towards a common source of mythology. Does that help?
Yes, I would say yes. As far as male and female energy goes, is there anything in your research that points to the idea that, as it said, Orion is like the male energy dominant area, or is that kind of not your area of expertise?
Well, in these images, so I'm going back to the images I have of Orion as a character. He's all male. There's no question that there's the male membrane is there, and I have him in 2 caves. It's a male. There are women. There are images of women in these caves, and the images that I see tie into a story from the West North Africa in a matriarchal society called the Tuareg or Amazigh. We call them Berbers. And these are the blue people in the Sahara, they're called blue people because they wear a turban that's blue and it leaches onto their skin. And they're nomads, and they're third world people, fourth world people like Native Americans or Eskimos. And in the Tuareg, as I said, it's a matriarchal society. And in these Paleolithic images, I see pretty definite 2 characters that come from a Tuareg story. And the older female character is doing all the talking, and the man is doing the listening in both the Paleolithic cave and the Tuareg story. So it's whether or not Orion is a hunter or a warrior or a great hero or all these sorts of things. It doesn't define whether who wears the pants in the society. And for the Tuareg and for the period of the El Castillo Cave Gallery disc, it's female. There's also many of these animals. I mentioned the mother giraffe, and most of the animals on these panels are females. And there's some sort of relationship between the mother and the child. And so they're metaphors of how do you pass on your beingness is through the females, and that the females nurture the young.
Thank you. Shifting gears, dolphins. Interesting thing about dolphins. There's a lot of people in the spiritual community who assert that dolphins have an extraterrestrial connection of sorts, and they're very intelligent too. It's been shown that dolphins do actually refer to each other by names that can be proven through like experiments with sonar and all. And also, I was at a dolphin watch recently. I've never seen so many on 11/11 Chief Colton Light Eagles conference. Never seen so many dolphins in my life, except of course for that Simpsons episode where they almost took over the world. But anyhow, is there anything in your research that suggests that dolphins, there is some ET connection to them, and they're here for a much more significant purpose other than being mammals in the sea?
That's a good question. Now, I'm not an ET specialist or anything like that, so I can't speak to it. But what is the relationship between dolphins and humans? In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, the dolphin communicates with people, saves people, and so on. In the Gallery of Disc Paleolithic image, the dolphin lifts up a man. Okay, and I can show you that. So there is they recognize then, as we do now, that dolphins are intelligent beings. and that we have kind of like a symbiotic. We have the opportunity to have a symbiotic relationship with them. There's stories in the Nile of dolphins, killing crocodiles and things like that, swimming under the bellies and slicing their stomachs and so on, and that people use dolphins to swim across dangerous rivers where dolphins existed in rivers or at the mouths of the rivers. So the question is, are dolphins really intelligent? Absolutely. Have we had a relationship with dolphins since now the chronicling of mankind? Yes, they were. We possibly swam with the dolphins across the Strait of Gibraltar, and that we might have helped in the Strait of Gibraltar. There's two currents. One goes into the Mediterranean. One goes towards the Atlantic, and it's possible that we use the dolphin as some sort of a vehicle. And in the Strait of Gibraltar, people swim across it today. It takes about 2.5, 3 hours. Some people have swum across it in 3 directions. So the concept of swimming across the strait is we do it in modern times. People did it in the past, and it's possible, based on these images, that people did it with dolphins. And if the Greeks and the Romans had seen these cave images, which they were there, there's evidence that they were there during those time periods, and they saw the image of the man with the dolphin, they could have easily come up with some of the stories that we have in mythology of man's relationship with dolphins, which people who are interested, ET type of people, would be drawing from. So this is the source book or the root book for many of the ideas and myths that we have in modern times.
Yeah, and the thing you mentioned about Devil's Tower, and now that's where a certain Indian tribe, Native American, tribe travels.
Lakota Sioux, the Lakota
Sioux. Yes. Interesting thing about Devil's Tower, Daniel Teague, who does healings and clearings, had the ability to scan for energy things and do clearings after a car accident. Strange phenomenon. A lot of people get into an accident and then they wake up with powers they never knew they had after the accident. It's an interesting phenomenon worth researching. But anyhow, he has the ability to scan negative energies. Daniel Teague has in certain locations of all the places on Earth. What is the highest that he's seen so far that in terms of negative energies? Devil's Tower in Wyoming. It's 11,000 negative energies, interestingly. And so I wonder, people that go to conferences there, do they really feel uncomfortable when they go there? And what did the Lakota Sioux? Well, actually, could it be that Devil's Tower didn't have such a high negative energy amount until after the Lakota Sioux started going there? Anything, and of course, there's the whole Close Encounters of the Third Kind thing. So, with that involving ET contact and gray-like aliens. So, as Steven Spielberg said, what's your take on all this stuff?
My take on it is it's all tied together. Okay. In the dreams of man, according to psychoanalyst Jung, in the dreams of man, we have a crossing of water, and we have a cosmic mountain. Okay. And so it is in prehistoric times, the crossing of water would have been the Strait of Gibraltar, and there are mountains on both sides of the strait, that very tall mountains that people would have climbed to be closer to the great beyond. The Lakota Sioux have fundamentally the same traditions as they were hunter-gatherers, fundamentally the same traditions and relationships with animal beings as these Paleolithic hunter-gatherers did 40,000 years ago. And so they kept the same stories. And one of the stories was to climb this cosmic mountain. And you've climbed mountains in your time. Maybe you haven't climbed, Everest or Kilimanjaro or anything like that, but you've climbed mountains. But why did you climb that mountain? There's something in us that we're drawn to climb that mountain. And around the world, there's hundreds of cosmic mountains. Every religion has a cosmic mountain. And in flat places where we don't have cosmic mountains, such as down in Mexico, we build pyramids. We did the same thing in Egypt. We built pyramids in replace of the cosmic mountain. At the end of the pyramid period in Egypt, they stopped making pyramids, and they moved the mummies, created the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And in that valley, it's under a mountain that has a pyramid-looking top. So again, they put a cave in the cosmic mountain, and that's where people went to rest. So going back to the Lakota Sioux, were interested in our so-called Devil's Tower because it is a cosmic mountain to them. Steven Spielberg recognized it deep in his psyche as a cosmic mountain. Whether or not he knew the Lakota Sioux were going there, it's something within us that we can't escape. We sort of relive our histories. We keep telling stories that we've told before. We kind of relive past lives by these archetypes which we encounter. We encounter a archetypal cosmic mountain, and we want to climb it. And we want to climb it because somewhere inside of us, we're going to reach into the great beyond. And that great beyond could be E.T., as Spielberg envisioned with Devil's Tower, or it could be to the great mystery for the Lakota Sioux. And when the Lakota Sioux were at their cosmic mountain, the so-called Devil's Tower, they had the Sundance. And the Sundance went on for a few days. And the Sundance, it was a time of suffering. And one person would be pinned to a pole, and for a few days, and he'd be tied to a pole through his skin with sinew. Sinew would go into, they use like a human or thread that would go into tie him to the pole, and he'd dance on the pole for a few days to the chanting and wailing, while at the same time people would be going around in a circle, and they themselves would have skulls tied to a string, which would be dragged behind them, which would be pulled off as they got lodged against the rocks and so on. And it was a time of suffering that they were created, and they believed that through this suffering, the great mystery, Wakantanka, which is the bison, Wakantanka would give them a blessing. And we know the famous we have the story of Sitting Bull and his time on the cottonwood tree during the Sundance, which wasn't at Devil's Tower. And in that story, Sitting Bull has a trance. He goes into a trance, and in that trance, he tells his dream of that the soldiers will fall like grasshoppers. And immediately following that, there's the battle with the American military, and Custer falls like a grasshopper. And so we have these stories because they're within us. We keep reliving them because we're drawn to the same archetypes. We interpret them in the same way as the Lakota Sioux did, and with the Steven Spielberg, and perhaps even the people who go to the conference out there, that they're drawn to Devil's Tower because they see it as a cosmic mountain.
That does actually make kind of sense. Talking about this whole thing about time periods, you mentioned crossing the Bering Strait around like 23,000 BC.
40,000 years ago.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm a little confused, and I think many people are, about was there any relationship or any contact with cavemen of the time and the people of the lost civilization of Atlantis? I mean, it said that there were the Atlantis did exist, and then everybody else around the world at that time was basically cavemanish. I mean, is that really do you resonate with that idea or not?
No, and that's well, if someone said that I was a caveman, that I could paint the ceilings of Altamira, the bulls, or the megalosaurus in Lascaux, I would be, ecstatic that I had that sort of abilities. We have to realize that we have geniuses in our modern time that come out of the individual. They don't come out of institutions. Einstein did his work as patent clerk on his own, did his major papers. Newton had his own lab that he didn't want anything to do with anybody else. And that's how there are geniuses in all times, geniuses who made the pyramids, and there are geniuses who did this art. And so everybody in the population didn't have the ability to paint the ceilings of Altamira, just like very few people could do it today. And I certainly couldn't do it. And these images in the gallery, this image in the gallery of discs at El Castillo Cave is much more elaborate than the panel at Altamira. So everybody being a caveman would be more, in my mind, would be more of a compliment than anything else. These were people who were in tune with all the animals in their environment. When they saw a lynx, they didn't just try to shoot it or throw a stick at it. They looked at the relationship between the mother lynx, the cat, and her kitten. And they saw a lion. They looked at they studied the tender moment and the relationship between the female and who goes up to lick the lion, as opposed to how that would make a nice rug. So the concept of were cavemen primitive, were cavemen without the sophistication that we have today is quite absurd. And we're still telling the same stories as we did then. And we talk of modern times. If we look at art itself, modern art came where we credit Picasso. And we credit Picasso's painting Les Dames d'Avignon, which is 1907. And there's two characters in Les Dames d'Avignon that have masks on. And the two masks are what define modern art as we know it. Those two masks come directly out of the cave of Altamira. I mean, exactly they're exactly the same masks. Picasso went on to borrow characters from the Paleolithic caves. The horse in Guernica comes out of Gros Père d'Ampère, which is on the Agnus Dei panel. It's a horse turning its head to the side or turning its head backwards. And other characters within Picasso's work come from the Paleolithic caves. So are we living as cavemen? Well, just as Picasso was, that he was seeking to learn something from our past, as was Joseph Campbell, who was looking at the mythology. And Joseph Campbell just didn't see stories. Joseph Campbell saw these metaphors that are within ourselves that tell us about our existence. So going back to the so-called the Atlantis, which many people follow, according to Plato, the story is about 10 to 12,000 years ago. These images are back to 40,000 years ago. So as a concept, in terms of art, there was much greater sophistication in art many more years before any now subterranean ancient societies that are below the seas.
Thank you. That's a subject that never seems to come up in conversation, like during the time of Atlantis. Was there? What was everybody like around the world that wasn't in Atlantis? And it's like nobody cares about those other people because only Atlantis is worth talking about the time it lived in. So, I mean, but anyhow, moving on. In the some parts of the continental United States, the caves there, it has been found evidence that ancient Egypt was, or some part of it, was here in the Western Hemisphere. At some point, I mean, there's also the whole thing about the nicotine and the cocaine found in some of the mummies in Egypt, and they're wondering how in the hell did that get in there, because those substances are only in the Western Hemisphere, and Egypt is in the Middle East. So you wonder, well, the ancient Egyptians were apparently here, if what the cave art suggests is true, and some of the artifacts, for that matter, that look Egyptian. So do you have anything to say about this subject, Egypt in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the caves of the continental United States?
Sure. I can't speak about the Egypt tobacco. I've never heard that before. But let's look at the question of did people in our North American hunter-gatherer past connect with people from the ancient world as we know it, so Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Western North Africa, of course? And I would say that the answer is yes and no. The answer is yes, because the mythology left that part of the world more than 23,000 years ago. And so we have common stories, myths between North America and in the Mediterranean, because they came from the same place. And I watch programs on TV that they find these commonalities with the cosmic egg, the cosmic mountain, the cosmic man, Ursa Major as the bear and the cosmic hunt. Well, it's because they all came from the same place, which is Western North Africa, Iberian Peninsula, about 40,000 years ago. I think Ursa Major is a really good one to explain it with. About 36,000 years ago, the constellation Ursa Major, in the springtime, just before dawn, was very close to the horizon, and it would be just as you would see a kind of a bear. Well, at that same time of year, bears ran close to the horizon, and so the Paleolithic artist, he sees the constellation just before dawn on the horizon, and then moments later he sees the mother bear, and he sees the mother bear and her cubs, moving along in the same place. So he connects one to the other. As we move into the summer, the bears can sit up a little bit, and just before dawn, Ursa Major kind of turns on her side, not backside, but sort of sideways. And in that image, in the Paleolithic image, you have the two cubs are standing, and the mother bear is looking at them, and so the mother bear is sort of standing up as well. And as we move into the late fall, early winter, the mother bear then goes to hibernate with her cubs. And at that time, just before dawn, Ursa Major has flipped around her back as if she's turning back in another direction. And so what people saw on the Earth at that time made complete sense to what they saw in the night sky. They had these myths. So in the United States, we have the cosmic hunt myth among the Micmacs, and instead of pretty much the same story as I just explained to you, is how the Micmacs tell it. And Micmacs are in the northern, let's say, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia area, and that same mythology runs down halfway down the East Coast. So people keep finding these commonalities between the ancient world and North America and Siberia. And the reason is that the myths were started long before people went over the Bering Strait. And the Paleolithic art suggests that they started about 40,000 years ago. And most noticeably 36,000 years ago in these caves on the Iberian Peninsula. So it's the common root. And in that we tell these stories so many times that it becomes part of us. It becomes part of our lore. It becomes part of our history. It becomes who we are. And I think that's it's something we keep missing. And I see the programs on TV, and they're brilliant. They have incredible speakers. They have awesome visual effects, and they have a pretty good history or a knowledge of mythology. And what they keep saying is that this happened here in North America. It happened in ancient Egypt. It happened in the Siberian Peninsula. Therefore, some common source must have come 12,000 years ago and given to everybody else. But that is like fails to recognize that the source is actually 20 to 30,000 years before then. It just says that we came from a common source. It doesn't mean that a common source gave it to us 12,000 years ago. And so if it's not A, then it must be, or B, it must be C. And I'm going to explain this one in a story. I said earlier that I lived in China in my mid-20s when I met George Schaller. And I was there during the Tiananmen Square time period. And I also traveled around the country. And at one point, I went to this small village in the northwest of China, or actually northeast of China, near the border of North Korea. And then in this place, I was probably the first Caucasian person to have been there ever. And the people there, they knew, because there was no TVs and there was no Newsweek Time, no magazines, anything that had pictures of people that were not like them. And the people there knew that there were Koreans, which were nearby. They knew they were Chinese because they were Chinese. And they had heard of this other person called Japanese. But they hadn't seen Japanese. Young people hadn't seen Japanese since the war, at the end of World War II. And I was in this small village, and this little boy points at me. And he says, ribbon ren. And ribbon ren means Japanese. And so I asked the boy in Chinese, I say, Ni kan wo ribbon ren ma? Have you ever seen a Japanese person? And he looked at me and he said, Mayo, he hadn't. So in his world, there were Chinese, there were Koreans, and there was this other thing called Japanese. And what we tend to do in our modern times is that if we can't find it with A or B, it must be C. It must definitely be C, because there's no other options. Well, there's a lot of letters in the alphabet past A. And I believe that, these Paleolithic caves and other sources such as mythology add a few more letters to the answers for our exploration.
I think you're onto something there indeed. And regarding the depictions in the cave art, well, first of all, one little side thing here. Dinosaurs and humans. It says by mainstream science they never actually coexisted, but apparently some archaeological discoveries suggest otherwise, and many of my folks in the spiritual but not religious community who I listen to say, yeah, humans and dinosaurs did coexist. So, any comments?
Well, good question. The question is really, am I seeing any in the Paleolithic images?
Yeah.
And the answer is no. But I've read Michael Cremo's work, and I've looked at the videos, and he's a pretty smart guy. And I'm pretty sure that's who you're drawing on. His work isn't millions of years ago. So there's really no. I'm in a complete whether I can't say whether he's right or wrong. It's not my thing. But I can say that I'm at 40,000 years ago max, and he's into the millions, so we're not on the same page. But it's he's a bright guy, and he presents interesting arguments. But were there dinosaurs walking around? They're now extinct in Paleolithic Europe. No, and we actually we didn't identify any animals that are no longer in either Western North Africa or Europe either. So there's, some of the Iberian lynx, which I mentioned earlier, is near to extinction on the Iberian Peninsula, but we still have them around. There are bears. There's bears in these images that could either be European bears. There were bears in Western North Africa at the time, are now extinct. But overall, between the two sides of the Mediterranean, we can pull together all these animals. So things haven't really, there's fewer of them, of course, but things haven't changed that much in terms of the animals in the last 40,000 years, except our disconnection with them.
Well, and in terms of connecting with them again, as someone who's been in caves and seen the art, do you think people who are nature lovers would consider a cave to be a nice place to hang out, or, well, no, it's not really a good place to hang out. There's not much life in a cave. You want to be a nature lover, you got to get into where all the flora and the fauna is, and not really in the cave where only the bats are. So, do you think caves are good for nature lovers, or what? Just asking for help.
Well, actually, I don't think the caves themselves, these Paleolithic caves, are about nature. I believe it's about people going to their psyche and finding their story. And Carl Jung, psychoanalyst Jung, had a dream, and in this dream he walks into an older home, and there's paint chipping off of the walls. And as he walks down the hallway, he sees plaster coming off the walls, and he recognizes it's ancient, like ancient Rome or something. And as he goes deeper into the cave, deeper into the hall, he enters a cave, and he sees it as a Paleolithic cave, and he in his mind, he comes to the conclusion that as we go deeper into ourselves, we enter this world of the Paleolithic, which is the cave of our minds, and that's where. So Joseph Campbell recognized this. Joseph Campbell wrote The Portable Young. I mean, he was on top of all this stuff, and Joseph Campbell passed that on to George Lucas, who put it into his script that Luke Skywalker enters the cave, which is himself. And I love that line from Yoda, and it's something like, the only thing you take into the cave is yourself. And it's brilliant. And that goes back to Joseph Campbell, which previously goes back to Young. Now, in these caves, the chambers that have the human beings are the deepest part of the caves. And so they would also, in these journeys or these images of the travel of the hero, they're in the deepest parts of our minds. And I believe that the caves weren't so much about connecting with nature, but that the apprentice goes on a journey, or the initiate, the potential shaman. He enters into the cave, which is the cave of his mind. And as he travels into it, he learns about himself. He learns about the natural world, and he comes to face his fears. And when he finally masters all these skills, he's ready to take the actual journey. And that journey, for some period of time, was to swim across the Strait of Gibraltar and travel into Western North Africa, and then back again. So I don't see these as natural environments, but I see them as part of the learning experience to become a shaman, or whatever word that they used at that time.
Thanks for giving your take. And another thing I'd like to ask you to give your take on, ancients depicting what they saw versus what they believe to be true. Now, this is kind of ties into the ancient astronaut theory too, even though ETs are not your thing. It's worth pointing out that the ancient astronaut theory kind of insists that what's on caves is what the ancients saw, so they depicted it. Well, and that's what they think. Okay, well, must be aliens. Well, okay, well, the problem is that the idea that, like, the religions and the mythologies around the world, that's just a false belief designed to suppress human consciousness. And some of the art, if it's religious or mythological art, is not what they saw, but what they believe to be true, but isn't true because it's a religion or a mythology. The only difference between religion and mythology, according to Jordan Maxwell anyway, you believe a religion to be true because you follow it. You believe that something is a mythology because someone else follows it and you do not adhere to it. That's the difference according to Jordan Maxwell. But anyway, this is about the cave art. Do you think most of the depictions, well, is there a percentage factor? I think that's the best way to ask this question. Percentages, what percent of the depictions are what they saw, and what percent are maybe religions or mythologies that they were suckered to believe are true?
Okay, so in Paleolithic times, people are animists, as were the Lakota Sioux. And animists believe that the clouds are a spirit, the stars are spirits, the animals, the mountains, the rivers, everything's a spirit. And if you remember the Pocahontas movie, and she talks about the colors of the wind, and she's hearing the tree, she speaks to the trees and the river and so on. Disney did a very good job of researching animism, and it's a good model to kind of put into perspective. So these people were animists. It wasn't a religion per se, but a way of seeing their world. And you've probably had people in your program, and I've heard recent times Neil deGrasse Tyson will say that we all come from stardust. Well, the animist would say, of course, we all come from that same place. We come from the same elements, and therefore we all have everything is conscious. And Rupert Sheldrake, the British biologist, would go along with that same concept. So the question, so they're animists, and they weren't Abrahamic religions and so on. But so if you the question then becomes, could they have looked at those images in the caves, whether in Paleolithic times or the ancients in the Mediterranean, and come up with some sort of divine being? And the answer is absolutely, without any question. Um, and to give you, earlier I had given you the sequence of characters that go across the panel of discs in El Castillo. You have the man, you have Agia, the eagle, you have the horse, Pegasus, and then you have the dolphin, which is Pisces. Well, the Agia, the eagle, overlaps with the man. And so the man has one of his arms is actually of the eagle. Um, and then when the man mounts the horse, the horse is overlaid over the man. The man is then riding the horse, and what do you call it? The wing of the eagle is now off of the horse. So then it becomes Pegasus. Well, what the Paleolithic artist did is, instead of putting, spanning these images which became constellations across the cave wall, they overlapped them, which would give so that the stories are all connected. And this hero, when he goes on his journey, he gains the wings, he rides the horse, he's catapulted by the dolphin, and so on. He all these magical abilities, just as Frodo is giving the magic cloak, and the sword the sting that wards against the goblins of sorts. So in these images you have the overlapping characters, and if you take that man with the wing, you have an angel. And that's a fairly common motif throughout the Paleolithic, and it becomes a common motif or archetype for people around the world. So you have this winged character that comes from the sky, that is a constellation in the sky, because the winged character is Hercules. It's the origin of Hercules, I should say. You have this winged character that comes from the sky, has a wing, and then and can fly through the sky on a horse, which is a fairly typical story among shamanic people in Siberia, as well as is told by in Islam from Muhammad, that Muhammad flies the flying horse to Medina or something like. I'm not an Islamic scholar. And Abraham flies a magic horse between his two wives. One, of course, which becomes Islam wife, and the other one becomes Judaism. So the ancients had seen these images, and they looked at them and they said, wow, there must have been at some time in the past a man with a wing who then could ride a winged horse and travel through the sky. And so there's a common source to all this, and around the world, show me a native hunter-gatherer dance that doesn't have someone wearing feathers. You can go out through North and South America, throughout Africa, and you'll find people who are following this avianoid archetype, because the avianoid is that intermediary of ascension to the great mystery. It was Horus for the ancient Egyptians, and I saw there's the Anunnaki is the one they use in your people know this better than me, but you have the avianoid, the man, which becomes the raptor, and that image goes back to the same place and the same time as the cosmic mountain, that we also carry around the world. So there's a belief that if everything must have happened 12,000 years ago, because that's when it starts showing up in the record. It's not true. These things go back almost 40,000 years ago, these same images. And if people in ancient times had seen them, they would have come up with all kinds of good stories about how the images were real in a time before their own.
Thank you very much. Have you ever seen the documentary series Knowledge of the Forever Time?
No. Who made it?
Uh, I don't know. It was a while since I saw it. It was on the UFO TV Studios, actually, which is now that used to be what it's called. It's now the UFO TV, the Disclosure Network YouTube channel, registered trademark. Um, and they aired a series talking about, among other things, depictions in caves and the cave art and such. And they suggested that the people that depicted the things in the caves, they knew about the nature of the cosmos. And one of the evidence for that, there are those cave art depictions that look like extraterrestrial heads, but they assert in Knowledge of the Forever Time that that's actually the what are perceived to be the eyes of the alien around in the round head is actually I believe it was the shape of some sort of a cosmic object, maybe a couple certain type of galaxy, or perhaps what you get in the nature of a black hole or something. I'm not drawing a blank on what it truly was, but it was not. They tried to emphasize this is not depicting an alien. No, this is depicting something up in the cosmos, the nature of the cosmos, and here on Earth, the people were trying to depict in the cave art. We know how the cosmos works and what it would appear like if you were to look through it through a telescope. Well, how'd they get that knowledge? Well, some are going to say, oh, aliens gave it to them. Well, no, maybe they meditated on it and saw through accessing higher consciousness that that's what it looks like. So, any comments? Was it the aliens that told them, or they just really high consciousness and we don't give them credit for it?
Okay, so it sounds like this is the story of the Dogon with Cirrus B.
Well, no, this
Is
was
that,
in North America, actually. We
oh,
were
North
talking about
America.
this.
Oh, okay.
Some caves in
Okay.
North America. Well, I guess the Dogon could also fall into something like this too. I mean, with they knowing what Sirius, the nature of the Sirius star system, actually is. Did the aliens give them that, or did they meditate on that? That's a fair question. Everybody in the ancient astronaut theory is going to say, "Oh, it was the aliens." And well, I'm an alien believer too, but I don't have to think that it was always the aliens that gave us the info, because I think you can act like remote viewing. That's another way to get this kind. If you're good at it, some are good at it, some aren't. But remote viewing meditation, it doesn't have to be the aliens who told you, and that's another example. So the Dogon in Africa, or this North America, or anywhere. What's
It's a
your
good
take?
question. Yeah, and it really there's a spectrum of ET, and on one end of the spectrum, there's an infinite universe, and anything is possible, right? And if you can, if anybody's going to argue against that, then they're nuts. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a belief that there's divine beings, which, where they're puppets, and everything that's happened in civilization as a result of some divine being which has given us inside knowledge. And that's not a new idea. That goes back thousands of years. People have been saying the same thing. The characters have just changed, and the technology of the characters, or the what they can possibly do, has changed. And so that's so people are in different ends of that spectrum. And my end of the spectrum is closely tied to, is near not exactly the end, but that we're in an infinite universe and anything is possible. And people have experiences which I don't discount, because I wasn't there, and I believe that people believe a lot of things which are true to them. And so I think that's it's fun to believe more than you might read on CNN, and there's probably more going on in the world that's on CNN too. It's definitely there's more going on in the world that's not in Fox News. Then the question then becomes: did ancient peoples, or prehistoric peoples and hunter-gatherers, did they have knowledge of astronomy? Well, the Paleolithic caves, especially this Gallery of Disc and El Castillo, shows that they definitely had knowledge of astronomy, that they knew the seasons, and they knew how to navigate by astronomy, which is very important. So Orion, as you get closer to the equator, Orion, his body is closer to the equator. Whereas if you're more north of the equator, there's more of his body is shown. So people could have traveled from north to south by observing what stars were available in the night sky. And they could have roughly told how far they were from their destination or their way back home. And that's probably what these Paleolithic cave panels were doing, not just telling the seasonality in the world right in front of them, but what they would see on their travels going down from Spain into Western North Africa. And I believe that the first navigators worked by the stars. Because you can see a mountain off in the distance. You can say, well, I can get to that mountain. I can get back to my river where I am, but it doesn't get you very far, and you're probably not going to survive as a group or a species or whatever, because your horizons are too close. But if you can navigate by the stars, you can travel long distances. You can go to a bison hunt weeks away, and then come back for a salmon run, or go off to pick berries and then harvest elk up in the mountains, because you can use the stars not just as time, but as navigational space. In the book, I draw on the Tuareg of the Sahara, and I give examples that they were using the stars for navigation in the desert. So these people don't have compasses. Actually, I don't know if they don't have magnetic compasses. They're not using magnetic compasses, and they certainly don't have GPS. They have no technology as we know it. But they're using the stars in the night skies to tell them what direction to go, and where they need to be in certain times and places. And in the case of the Lakota Sioux in the Black Hills, they traveled around the Black Hills with the ultimate destination at what we call Devil's Tower, based on the stars. And the across North America and into the Bering Strait today on both sides, people are using stars for navigation. So the navigation via stars goes back at least 23,000 years that we can, say this is what it is, because people on both sides are doing it with a fairly high degree, and they're actually even telling the same stories related to their celestial navigation. So do these characters in the cave art tell that you saw in the show tell more than that? I didn't see it, so I really can't defend it one way or the other.
Fair enough. So one other thing that about cave art that I think is always worth asking about, it seems to come up a lot in programs I've seen regarding cave depictions. Psychoactive substances depicted in cave art. It seems the more common one is the Amanita muscaria mushroom. Appropriate I bring that up because it's Christmas time, and it said that the fat man in the red suit, that's actually a depiction of the Amanita mushroom, and the stories about Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, Blitzen, and Rudolph prancing around is reindeer eating, well, the way they prance around after they eat the Amanita mushroom. But is there, aside from Amanita, is there any other psychoactive substance depictions in the cave art? And if there is, how in the world did these primitive hunter-gatherers find out which substances are psychoactive? I mean, did they actually have taste testers in the tribes who would actually risk their life and find out if a mushroom was deadly poisonous or psychoactive and give you a nice trip? I mean, how exactly did that work? Any comments?
Yeah, so earlier I drew on that my experience in China, where there was I met the little boy who was Chinese, who, I wasn't Chinese, and I'm not obviously Korean because I'm not Asian. Therefore, I must be Japanese. And with the mushrooms, we're still on the A's. And with the many other A's that are out there, there are no depictions of mushrooms on the walls of the Paleolithic caves in Europe. And the one you're referring to, the base and core ingredient is psilocybin, the Amanita. There's no depictions. People may say they're in other places. I don't know. I haven't seen them, but no one's actually pointed to a picture, as far as I've ever heard, and said that's a mushroom. And there's actually very few plants depicted in the Paleolithic caves, and the ones that are depicted are like leaves or sticks and things like that, which tell more. There's in the Lascaux cave, and there's a panel with females around, kind of like a chamber on both sides. And on one side, it's a spring scene. We have the dropping of the young. On the other side, it's a fall scene, a fall winter scene, where you see branches without leaves, and that's partly how they depicted it. And so that's like the plant matter. So then the question really becomes: can somebody paint without psychedelic substances? Because that's really the core of this thing. And when you were in school, you took art classes, and I'm pretty sure that nobody, if it was taking any type of psychedelic substances, but they were doing art in the classroom. And famous, Picasso, I gave the example of earlier, who invented modern art as we know it, which he drew heavily from Paleolithic art. He wasn't taking psychedelic substances. He was up all night. He was on coffee, cigarettes, and he had a wife and 2 mistresses at the time. He was emotionally enraged. So people can create art without psychedelic substances, and it's more common to do so than with psychedelic substances. The advent of there are places such in the Amazon where shamanic people are using psychedelic substances, and it's part of their tradition. And there are places in Africa as well. I talked about the Tuareg earlier. They go into a trance stance without any type of psychedelic substances. The Bushmen in Africa and the Kalahari don't use psychedelic substances. The native Sitting Bull, when he was on that Sundance pole, he wasn't using a psychedelic substance, but he came to that vision of the people without ears falling like grasshoppers, or grasshoppers without ears. So the two are mostly inseparable, but in modern times they've seemed to come together. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's become a major movement. One of the reasons I don't see psychedelic substances as being part of Paleolithic art is that there's too much detail in the Paleolithic art. Details of times and places, seasonality, and so on. When people make, I've seen some of the art in line of people who've taken psychedelic substances, and it's a vision that's coming from within their head. It's real to them, and it's absolutely beautiful art. But it's not of, a man, all these constellations in a row, and the animals as the Greeks, or the beings as the Greeks saw them. It's not of lions on the hunt. It's not of bison, running. It's not of all these incredible types of scenes, natural scenes that we find in the Paleolithic art. So it doesn't seem to make any sense, and to me, for Paleolithic art. Now, it may be in other places. I can't speak to it. I said Paleolithic European art. I can't speak to that, but I believe that a good example is down in the Chaco Canyon area of the American Southwest. There used to be there were spirals that are still there, and for a long time, people were saying the same thing, that there's some sort of hallucinogenic experience triggered by psychedelic drugs and so on. Well, sooner or later, someone went out there with a compass around the winter solstice, and they said, "Oh my goodness, that it's not just that spiral, but there's a rock in front of it that casts the shadow at the winter solstice, and you can tell, part of the year through these." And they've since become very famous as at Chaco Canyon and the winter solstice spirals, and they found them at the summer solstice as well. If we left the Chaco Canyon spirals at the product of psychedelic drugs, we never would have figured that one out. And so my sense is that most of these have nothing to do with it. And here's kind of an analogy. You might have a child, and a child's in school. A kid comes home from school with a D on the math test, And the kid says, well, the teacher must have been on drugs because I couldn't understand the math test. What would you tell your kid to, maybe you need to figure out what drugs a teacher's taking, or do you sit down and help them to learn the material on the math test? Because then you can move forward, just as people did with the Chaco Canyon spiral sundials. So Andrew, there's a question for you. What do you tell your kid?
Well, I don't have a kid, but I hope that'll change soon. Some psychics told me I'll be moving with my dream girl in late 2018 or late 2019, but okay, I'm digressing here. Frankly, I think I'd tell my kid, what evidence do you have other than your own theory? So, yeah, and then see what the answer is from him. So, I don't know. But, can we change the subject now, or do you have anything else to say about this?
Oh, I'm done with that one.
Okay. So,
And that's a controversial subject. I recognize what I just said. It would be very controversial to a lot of people in today's community.
Okay, well, I'm glad you gave me some talking points so we can finish up this interview. Glad we were able to go a full 2 hours on just cave art, although I've been told that may cost me some listeners because people have lousy attention spans, but all right, anyhow, I'm digressing. Some quote you put up here, I guess I might as well ask you to elaborate on the significance of this and why you believe this to be true. That quote is, identity is only an illusion created by those who have an alternative version of our origins. Please elaborate and please back up the truth value of that statement.
Absolutely. So if you look at the mythology, we looked at the culture that we come from, the Paleolithic and these images that people around the world draw upon. We're telling the same stories. And some person might say that the hero was wearing a hat. Another person might say that he was wearing a sword, and so on. But we ultimately come from the same place. And so whether our favorite football team has a beaver as a mascot or a duck, and I'm here in Oregon where it's all about ducks and beavers, it's a fabricated identity. We all come from the same place. And it's 40,000 years ago isn't that long ago. And so, yes, we've made deviations on that story, on these basic myths and these that are mirror in the sky, the night skies. But we're still the same people who tell the same stories, and we ultimately have the same identity. The color of our skin may change, and how we wear our hair and what clothes and so on. But deep down, as demonstrated through the Paleolithic cave art, as through the work of Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, and that of psychoanalyst Jung, that we're still the same people. So to think that person, because they're across the ocean someplace else, is different for us, it just isn't so. We are one world community. That we just, there's just a few of us that need to get around the table more often and sing Kumbaya or something.
Thank you. And the next slide here, Carl Jung, I should say. In the cave, I discovered the remains of a primitive culture that is the world of primitive man within myself. Is that just, in a nutshell, basically a statement saying, I realize that since we're infant consciousness, those people who made the art in the cave are a portion of me, or is there a lot more significance than just that behind what Carl Jung is stating here?
You just summarized that, and that goes back to the story I had before of Jung's dream, where he walks into the home, and then he walks into the ancient plastered walls, and then ultimately to the cave. So that comes from the same place within his work, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And it's that we retain these memories, we retain these archetypes, we repeat our personal, family, and societal histories, because we as individuals haven't changed in tens of thousands of years. You still there?
Sorry, this happens every show. I'm on mute and I don't realize it. Okay, moving on. Another quote that you've put up here that I guess is another worthwhile talking point. There may be no greater encyclopedia of knowledge to be read, and no archaeological ruin so bountiful in its discoveries than the history of mankind that remains in the deepest chamber of the cave that is our minds.
And
Okay.
that's a play on Young. And also, very very similar statements have been made by Joseph Campbell, um, and of course Yoda, who tells Luke Skywalker that the only thing you'll find in the cave is yourself. But when we go into we can count numbers forever. Um, we can create inventions and so on. But when it all comes down to it, the deepest place that we can learn about ourselves is in our own minds. And Jung said that he had met many famous people and industrialists and scientists during his time, and the person that he was most enthused or learned the most about was through his own going into his own unconscious. That we have more to learn by discovering things about ourselves than to travel oceans and so on. I think there's many modern mystics who would, Eckhart Tolle and so on, would say the same type of thing.
Thank you. There's this quote here um, that, well, I was reading it over and see the thing about myths here. Want to see how this ties in with what I mentioned earlier about myths and religions. Well, Jordan Maxwell, I should say, says that myths and religions being the same, but the one difference is it's a matter of who believes it. But anyway, the quote here is, myths are passed through the seasons of the night sky as constellations and stars projecting man's psyche into the cosmos. Characters that are light years from Earth but still within the grasp of a human imagination. Well, that first part about myths are passed through the seasons of the night skies, constellations, and stars. Um, well, okay. I guess I should have asked you earlier. Do you agree or disagree with that claim that religion and myth is the same thing? It's just that religion, you believe it and you follow it, but a myth, you call it a mythology because someone else believes it and you don't believe that to be true. It's like when your neighbor believes but you don't believe it to be true. That's mythology. It's a perspective issue, the difference. Do you agree or disagree with that? And if you disagree with, judging by the statement you've made here, you would have to disagree with that because because you seem to suggest that there may be truth to the nature of the constellations in some regard. Or am I wrong there?
Well, there's a few questions there,
Okay.
and this is how I look at religion itself. And this is kind of almost a quote from Eckhart Tolle, and he says that religion is when you follow somebody else's spirituality, and spirituality is when you have your own experience. Okay, so people can be spiritual without being religious. People can follow mythology without and being spiritual. So I believe that believing or not so religion is when you follow somebody else's spirituality. And so there have been many great prophets and who have said incredible things. And to follow them would be, in an organized fashion, would be a religion. So mythology and spirituality. There's something inside of us that helps us to understand these myths. If you're going down through the mall and someone grabs the purse of a young woman, well, right away she's frightened, and you could recognize that. And if you have a 1-year-old sees the same person, she'll recognize as well. So the person, your 1-year-old, is recognizing there's a damsel in distress, that young woman. And then the man becomes, he could be Darth Vader, he could be a dragon, he could be the Black Knight. And of course, if you run to her aid, then you become the hero, you become St. George who slays the dragons and so on. Somehow we retain all these archetypes in our memory. How we do it is Jung believed it was a collective unconscious, or there was somehow these archetypes are stored within us. Is that it's not scientific. No one can repeat these things, but there's very few people who couldn't come up with that same analogy or can't identify the story. Most of the movies in Hollywood are made with this framework of the hero's journey. It's so that people can understand and follow the story. If there was a Seinfeld that was made once where they made the program backwards, and it was all discombobulating because people didn't understand the story. They couldn't catch the flow of it. But most stories, the screenwriters in Hollywood have books that explain the hero's journey structure and how they need to follow that so that everybody can keep their attention in the movie. But it's not scientific that we can do this. So one could say that it's spiritual, but it's spiritual of following a myth from our past. So I think the lines between myth and spirituality are pretty gray, and then if you're following the myth of somebody else's society, you could say it's a religion. So we're heading towards Christmas, and there's the so-called Little Drummer Boy story that has a modern origin. In 1,000 years, someone can hear that story and they could believe that, might think we believed it at that time, that was part of our religion. And David Bowie's song was what we sang to as part of our belief. I believe that it's very gray between those three, but clearly spirituality, religion is when you're following somebody else's spirituality, and spirituality and myth are very hard to separate because there's something inside of us that we retain these archetypes. It's a fascinating subject, and to see it go back to the Paleolithic caves is incredible.
Indeed, it is incredible, and there's some incredible stories to tell, and that moves on to the next statement here. We are wired for stories in our search to find the meaning of life. Now, hold on just a second here. Depends on what kind of story you're telling. The whole idea of what is a myth, what is a legend, and what's a folk tale. Well, in general, this is according to Wikipedia. I know you can question it as a source, but if it's just a simple little definition, then a folk tale, they say, is just a story that's a story and believed to be fiction by the people that tell it. But legends and myths are beliefs that have kernels of truth to them by the people that tell them. And the difference there is legends are more down to earth and myths are more not down to earth, really more high level stuff. But maybe you did, I guess, do you agree or disagree with that difference between myths, legends, and folktales, as Wikipedia puts it? And when you're looking for stories to search for the meaning of life, I mean, are fictional folktales based on truth acceptable, or does it make more sense to tell the myths and the legends to find the meaning of life?
Well, I believe that they're fundamentally the same thing. And I believe that all three of them are based on archetypes. I used to go to for a short time, I went to a group, and they read fairy tales. And these are fairy tales that have been analyzed by psychoanalysts. And people would tell, we'd go around and read a paragraph of this fairy tale. At the end, we would express our belief in what the fairy tale would say, or what the characters were doing. And as you went around the circle, you listen to other people, and it's really about learning their perspective on life. And you would learn if they were introvert or extrovert, or they're a thinker or a feeler. And it was really like a group therapy, this fairy tale session. And the person who moderated it was a psychotherapist. But it was not a clinical psychotherapy session, and more of a self-help type of group. But the concept is that from all these myths, folk tales, and legends that we hear and that we retell, we're telling stories about ourselves. And before I gave the hypothetical story of you being the hero who's about to save the young woman in the mall who has had her purse snatched from her. Is that a myth? Is it a legend? Or is it a fairy tale? If it was a fairy tale, if she's the princess and you're the knight in shining armor, it's a myth. If you were a Greek warrior and she was Helen of Troy, it's a legend if a Native American told it with Pocahontas and Smith. So I believe that all these stories are designed to tell us about ourselves so we can express who we are. And we're wired for these stories. And in the case of George Lucas, he's telling a story about the relationship between him and his father. His father doesn't want him to be a producer. His father wants him to get a 9-to-5 job in a factory or something like that. And whereas George Lucas wants to travel around the galaxy. He wants to explore all there is that there can be. He wants to take his hero's journey. And his father has taken all the journeys in life and saying, just stay home, just stay home. And the same story with Nemo. Nemo's father says, stay here. And Nemo says, I have to go. But the father says, well, all there is on here on the reef. So we tell these stories through myths, legends, and fairy tales to express who we are, because it's a heck of a lot more interesting to tell a story or to hear a story than just about you're the one, you ran after a guy who snatched a woman's purse in the mall. It gets a lot more interesting when you're the hero and she's the at least for little kids, more interesting when you're the knight in armor who chases the dragon who stole the jewel from the princess. And so we're wired for these stories. It tells us about who we are, and it helps us to express the great mysteries in life.
Thank you. And as far as the future of finding cave art, I mean, it's said that we barely scratched the surface in regards to what's down below. There's a lot of forces that don't want us to dig in certain places because we'll uncover things that will rewrite history. So, what do you see regarding the future of depicting finding cave art that depicts certain things? Do you think we'll unearth more and find more in places that we never knew caves could have actually have been? And do you think in general it will raise human consciousness, or humans too apathetic about things like cave art that it's really not gonna have an effect?
Good question. And really it goes down to the archaeologists are very good at what they do. And what they do is they dig in caves, they sift through layers of sediment, and they date objects. And that is the mind of the archaeologist, and that's not my mind. I could never do that sort of work. The images that I used for my book were already published. So these images that people just didn't see the elephant, they didn't see the lion, they didn't see any of these characters because they weren't looking at them. But they weren't looking at them not because they're not there, because they're distracted. In the case of the gallery disc, they're distracted by these red discs. And people just start counting the red discs, is what archaeologists do and most scientific people do. And so people are drawn towards the illusion. And when they're drawn towards the illusion, they miss the elephant in the room. And we're psychologically drawn to these illusions. We can't get away from it. We drive down the highway, and there's a red stoplight, and that makes us stop. Women wear red lipstick as attraction. You drive down any strip and you see McDonald's and Burger King, you're going to see a lot of red as well as a DQ. So you don't need to dig into these caves to find any more information. You need to go back and look at the panels that we already have the photographs of, and take the eyes away from the distractions, such as the red discs on this panel, and go look at what else is in there. There's many other panels that I didn't put in the book, but I saw things. But Picasso saw things, and Picasso took direct images right out of the caves and put it into his artwork. So people see these things, and they use them for their own benefit, or their own amusement. And Picasso, he died with over $300 million tucked away somewhere. So you don't need to be digging to find information. But if you go back into the panels that already exist, that we already have printed in the books, take a look. And you might find things about yourself that you didn't notice before, and about people from the distant past. And will we find more about ourselves? Well, most certainly, because the archaeological record of mythology dated to, let's say, 23,000 years ago, when people came across, were in the Bering Strait and had the same myths as both sides of the Pacific. But now we can go back to almost 40,000 years ago and see that not only are we telling the same stories, but we have the same characters in the stories. And we can learn about these characters, such as the avianoid, the birdman, and the horse that flies, and about dolphins, and about our relationship with the lions and the giraffes, that help us to live in a more ecological and conscious society.
Thank you. And for those that want to tour the world and see this, can you give us some places that give us that deserve an A plus in regards to the cave art that's worth looking at if you're a tourist? And for that matter, can you also give us the locations that deserve a D or an F in regards to cave art? These are not places you should go, because there's really nothing interesting there regarding cave art, if that makes sense. So hot spots and low spots on Earth for this.
Well, I would say that whenever you look at rock art, not just cave art, wherever that is in the world, you're learning about people from the past. And so there's no A's, B's, C's, or D's. What is the world that person was involved in? There's an image in Western Oregon, and you can only see it during the low, just before the sun comes up, and there are two elk that are etched into a wall, and you can go there any other time of the day and you can't see it. And so during the at noon it was a D, but just before light it was an A, and they're life-size elk, and they're next to some other pictographs that are very easily to see there. So I'm not sure if there's A, B, C, or D. I believe that around the world, when you go to see the ancient and Paleolithic rock art, you're going to a place of people from the past, and we can learn from them. We can take these archetypes and see where they fit in. If everybody has the same archetypal characters, and so what can we learn about ourselves by looking at the rock art? But no scale A through D, just a two lines in an X could be beautiful to one person, whereas another person might needs a herd of bison to stimulate their imagination. But within those two X lines, there might be more in the environment that they could be a sundial that could tell us more about ourselves than a herd of bison.
Thank you very much. And any ideas or suggestions on how we can circumvent, for lack of a better word, the forces out there that don't want us to uncover stuff like archaeological finds and cave art and art depictions that rewrite history? How do we circumvent that obstacle, the powers that be blocking this stuff? Any ideas or suggestions?
Good question. That's an excellent question, because that's one of the common things that people they get pushback. And well, my work it's a pretty big tent. There's people in the alternative archaeology side. There's mainstream archaeologists. I can see who's liking, following, sharing my stuff on Facebook and Twitter, and who's contacting me. I can see who's getting under this tent. It's a pretty big tent. And so I'm not an established archaeologist. I'm not in the mainstream. I'm not. People want to know or want to learn more, but you have to look at science as an industry, and in any industry, there's corporations, and IBM doesn't push Apple software, and GE doesn't sell Whirlpool microwaves or washing machines or whatever the contraption is. And so if you want to advice to people who are not in the mainstream, who have an alternative idea, is find who are the listeners in the mainstream. Obviously in my work, people from Western North Africa who are interested in their roots are definitely on board with this. And I have presentations coming up. One's in a few weeks at a major university here in Oregon, in anthropology. And I brought something to the table that the person was interested in, or that the group was interested in. I've spoken in the past to astronomy groups. Astronomers love this sort of stuff. They're open for, astronomers have all kinds of ideas. And if you've got archaeoastronomy that ties something ground to earth, they're interested in it. But if people that are not mainstream, if you just complain that no one's listening, mainstream doesn't like it, and someone's shutting down this or not let me into that, just go open other doors. Find the corporations that are interested in your work, and maybe you're not going to get some big corporations, but there's some small companies and there's startups, people working out of their garages. And there's lots of room to be heard, especially on social media, podcasts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. My book was released late September, and within just a few months later, I have 4,000 followers, likes, and on Facebook, and other multimedia is taking off. And none of this stuff I kept this in the dark. There was less than 10 people that had seen this work before it went to print, before it was released on ebook. And the reason was that I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to let it out. I want to get all my ducks in a row. But in a very short period of time, a lot of people have caught on to it. And I've had many invitations to do programming of different types. So it's a boundless, infinite universe with many possibilities. And there's a spectrum where people can be heard and speak.
That's good to know. And with that being said, we've gone just about 2 hours. I guess I'll give you a couple minutes to get out anything you like and your contact info and any websites you got and all the rest of it. And then I guess we'll call it a show.
Well, thanks, Adria. This was really a cool show. I've listened to a number of your other shows, and so I especially like the Jonathan Young one. My book, Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, is found on all the ebook mediums. But if you're not interested in reading the book, go to beforeorion.com or Before Orion on Facebook. I'm Bernie Taylor OR at Twitter, and Before Orion at Instagram. Like it, follow it. Just explore the horizons. And I didn't include all the caves or panels that I could see characters in. There's so many more out there that people have a next great adventure to find things on their own. And I wish everybody a happy New Year and holiday season.
I wish the same thing to you. We give a nice Christmas present out there to all the cave art lovers. So with that being said, I guess I'll bring the show to an end. It was a pleasure having you on. Thank you for reaching out to me. I always encourage people to do that. Please, if you're going to reach out to me, please be a legitimate guest who's going to awaken us, humanity, and give the true nature of reality for what it is and what it is not, please. So not a sales pitch or anything. I do give people the opportunity to give sales pitches on my show sometimes if they have products that can help, but all right, I'm babbling and digressing. So that being said, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Enjoy the rest of your track, that infinite consciousness. Good luck on the rest of your work. Bernie Taylor. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.